Madangguk, Community Art and Political Expression. Act 1. Brief explanation of Korea in the 1980s, with the lens of activism and democratization. One afternoon, on August 22, 1987, 21-year-old Daewoo Shipbuilding Company worker Lee Seok-gyu died from assumed acute respiratory failure after protesting for workers' rights. After further inspection, Lee was found with several metallic fragments lodged in his right lung. Lee and his 2,000 fellow protesters were tear-gassed by local police officials, who tried to brutally disperse the protesters away from the executive Daewoo Shipbuilding Company building. Later, this event would stir even more protesters and rally cries enraged by Lee Seok-gyu's death, bordering hospitals and impeding traffic while banging on traditional Korean drums. To provide context for this incident, South Korea was at the time under the authoritarian rule of Chun Doo-an, who established Korea's Fifth Republic with himself as the ruler in the 1980s after the assassination of previous President Park Chung-hee. Presidents were elected based on the votes of an internal electoral college picked by the regime, thus establishing an authoritarian rule under the guise of democracy. Local, especially student, activism, and radicalism became heightened under the rule of Chun Doo-an, seen through the Gwangju massacre, which killed hundreds of civilians and local students after President Chun's declaration of martial law. During President Chun's authoritarian rule, virtually every act of protest or rebellion was deemed highly problematic and dealt with via brutal acts such as imprisonment and torture.
Police have been clashing regularly with students in a recent wave of violent anti-government protests.
Known as the 1987 June Democratic Struggle, a series of protests led by tens of thousands of students resulted in police brutality and the death of Lee Han-yul, who died from a tear gas canister penetrating his skull. In the Chosun Ilbo's coverage of President Chun's summer conference speech from the Blue House, he stated, "Beware of the rise of elements that destroy the system. I don't think there is an alternative to constitutional amendment. If the constitutional amendment effort is stranded due to being entangled in the interests of a specific individual or political faction, it would be committing an irreversible sin against the people and history." Clearly, the president, administration, and constitution of Korea's Fifth Republic were not particularly welcoming to public outcry or democratic criticism of its rule, with strict scrutiny measures being placed upon those who chose to speak out against the government. Act 2. Introduction of Madangguk and Pungmul, repurposing culture as protest. This era of democratization for South Korea saw the resurgence of the tradition. Madangguk forms of resistance theater began to become popularized within this era, as people had to avert their frustrations through interpretive works of art to swerve governmental critique and consequence. The era also found the popularization of Pungmul, a type of performance featuring traditional Korean percussive instruments alongside synchronous choreographed dance. Pungmul and Madangguk were similar in their features of common character archetypes such as the Yangban, social elite, Choridang, Buddhist monk, and Harmi, grandmother. These efforts were made to encourage audience participation, writes scholar Catherine and Young Lee in their paper, The Drumming of Dissent During South Korea's Democratization Movement. By featuring common archetypes, the performances demonstrated their commitment to honoring their community and connecting with a wide range of demographics. This was done by embracing the performance traditions of the common people of Korean history, writes scholar Lee. There seems to be a common theme regarding community and the common people, as these forms of art such as Pungmul weren't created with protest in mind. Rather, Pungmul was used as a form of entertainment for a blue-collar, pre-industrialized agrarian society, commonly played in the fields to motivate workers and increase productivity. The idea of Kongdonche, the belief that those working in agricultural society were connected, was also deeply tied to community. These themes of collective solidarity and tradition were infused into the origins of Pungmul, thus serving a great foundation for political activism. Subsequently, they were recontextualized by youth in the 1980s to aid in the democratized protests and public demonstrations. In particular, scholar Lee writes that Pungmul was likely used as a form of protest due to its inherent loudness easy to learn rhythms, and strong ties to tradition. Specifically, in the 1980s context, these genres of sound often associated with rural villages were effectively reshaped to become performance that served an outwardly political agenda. Act 3. The failure of the government to define culture. While the Minjung movement was in full force, there were also efforts by the government to invent their own traditions, as the nation moved further away from their previous era of war and colonization. Through the effort to ditch culture in order to modernize, or more correctly, westernize, the Korean government participated in many acts that inhibited cultural growth. Even through these acts strongly dissuading forms of protest and inherent propagation of culture by the people, the Korean government continued to undermine works of culture that were in opposition to their nationalist desires to control the nation-state narrative of South Korea, rather than facilitating the already developing Minjung cultures. In their book, The Making of Minjung, scholar Nam-hee Lee articulates that traditional folk culture such as Pungmul and Madangguk defied forms of stasis, instead serving as spontaneous expressions of the everyday lives of people and communities. Furthermore, the government's efforts to keep tradition intact as a symbol and reminder of Korea's past was decontextualizing and in the territory of museumization, where the government refused to allow people actively define and mold the national culture, but rather desired a static narrative the government itself controlled. Scholar Lee says they had become state-led events that did not give participants a sense of ownership. This ties back into the earlier community argument. When a participant does not feel a sense of ownership over the ritual act of the demonstration, nor identifies with its values, they do not feel connected with a greater community. Act 3.1. Counter-argument. Elites defining Korea for themselves, not the nation. Although student activism became a primary catalyst for democratization and social change in South Korea, the inaccessibility of higher education, locked to the wealthy elite, poses an interesting ironic argument. Lee Han-yul, the aforementioned deceased protester, was a Yonsei University student, one of the top 3 prestigious universities in Korea, known as Sky Universities. There is an argument to be made that the government's efforts to simulate culture fell flat because it lacked the consideration of community. However, it would be inaccurate to generalize that these protesters, mostly students from elite institutions, were representative of the whole country, defining culture on their own terms. Rather, they highlighted an incongruity. Mass dance was only the intellectual's hobby, which emulated plebeian aesthetics. The rise of Pungmul and Madangguk can also be viewed as the educated, privileged, and westernized few, creating broad narrative strokes that redefine the nation under the guise of democratization. Act 4. The Happening. Taking a step back from the student's lens. When speaking of South Korea's movements to create or rediscover tradition, we often leave out artists that are actively creating new works entirely unrelated to tradition. Modern art very much existed during this time period, and was utilized as forms of activism as well.
This is a lecture on how to make a happening. There are 11 rules of the game. 1. Forget all the standard art forms. Don't paint pictures, don't make poetry, don't build architecture, don't arrange dances, don't write plays, don't compose music, don't make movies. And above all, don't think you'll get a happening out of putting all these together. 5. Break up your time and let it be real time. Real time is found when things are going on in real places. It has nothing to do with the single time, the unified time of stage plays or music. It has even less to do with slowing down or speeding up actions because you want to make something expressive or because you want it to work in a compositional way. Whatever happens should happen in its natural time. 7. Since you're in the world now and not in art, play the game by real rules. Make up your mind when and where a happening is appropriate. If your image calls for the president and vice presidents of Chase Manhattan sitting in their biggest vault and throwing gold coins around like babies, and you can't get them to do it, then forget it and go on to something else. 9. When you've got the go-ahead, don't rehearse the happening.
Thought to have been inspired by American artist and father of the happening, groups like Union Exhibition of Young Artists created works such as 1967's A Happening with a Vinyl Umbrella and a Candle. Artists were very much active in the politics of the nation, even a decade before the mass student protests. The artist placed the candle onto the umbrella and the woman stands up, With solemn expressions, the group moves in circles before blowing out the candles, ripping the umbrella apart, winding toilet paper and strings around it, stamping on it. According to the materials at the time, the vinyl umbrella represents contemporary civilization and the idea of the nuclear umbrella, while candles represent pure spirit. And murder at the Han Riverside, another happening where the trio of artists buried themselves 100 meters below in a pit beneath the Hangang Bridge. The artist read out cultural con, culturally blind, culturally averse, holder of culturally illicit fortune, cultural peddler, and cultural acrobat on written plastic sheets, then gathered them up and burned them. The work criticized the reactionary cultural system and the corrupt National Art Exhibition-centered world of Korean art. Act 5. Conclusion. In a time sensitive to any form of protest, these works simulated an environment allowing for safer discourse against the government, while engaging the community and not being inherently elitist. These works acted as a form of precursor to the major student democratization movements of the 1980s. Although these forms of performance art remained in the sidelines for society's weird and unconventional, they became repopularized in modern-day study, where these forms of happenings rejected many of the preconceived narratives of South Korea being stuck in the tradition or the old. Although activism led to the dismantling of the Fifth Republic, it can't be helped to ask the speculative question, what if these forms of happenings became mainstream? From looking at past government attempts to create culture, it's clear that in order to create something culturally significant, it also needs to be under the consent and participation of the people. The democratization of culture, where all people from any class have agency to produce and consume culture. What would have happened if these forms of performance art rose instead of Madangguk and Pungmul to create acts of protest that were for all?